The real application is in displays. That's a much easier application than biology. That should have been the first application. But because, we were all chemists working with biologists as opposed to working with electrical engineers, we didn't think of it.
When did you realize that there were applications? Like, did you know it before the experiments worked out, or is it something that really came after, like in the aftermath, you started talking to people and looking at, okay, how can you use this new capability?
It was in the aftermath. Right. So,
like, was biology even on your radar actually when you were doing this?
No, not in 93.
Mm-hmm.
Not in 93. But you're at MIT. You're surrounded by people that have all sorts of interest, and you talk to a lot of people, right? And what we had was a material that was quite bright in terms of the emission, very narrow emission, and more importantly, the absorption spectrum starts at the band gap into the blue uniformly. I mean, it just keeps on going up into the UV. If you have a dye molecule, the absorption spectrum mimics the fluorescence. So it has a finite range. So if something that fluoresces at 600 nanometers, you want to excite it. If it's a dye molecule, you excite it at 560 nanometers. If you try to excite it at 400 nanometers, the absorption cross-section just is very low. There's just no absorption there. But with the dots, that wasn't true. And this was right around the time that gallium nitride diodes were invented. Right, Nakamura, working for Nichia, had discovered how to make gallium nitride diodes, a source of blue, cheap, blue light at around 450 nanometers. That was perfect for the quantum dots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just perfect. And so that's really what triggered the idea of all these potential applications, that we had these sources of blue light. The dots were perfectly suited, and as chemists, we knew the size was similar to a biological protein, a big protein or something like this. I knew, and Paul knew, and Shimon Weiss was working on biological fluorescence at UCLA. But I was surrounded by people in my own department who do imaging of cells with dyes, right? And I've got this thing is multicolored that I can multiplex. So a dye molecule, if you have, at the time, you have 5 different things you want to label on a cell with 5 different colors, you need 5 different lasers to excite the 5 different colors, right? But if you want to have one laser, let's say a blue laser with the dots, you use one excitation, and you just change the surface of the dot to label different parts of the cell, and in one go you can multiplex in a way that I thought you couldn't do with dye molecules. And that really was the selling point for the application, something that's bright, that you can multiplex in a way you couldn't do with dye, and that perhaps was more stable to photobleaching, because dye molecules, if you excite them with light for too long, they sort of peter out, they bleach out. And the dots didn't seem to have that problem. So that was the impetus for going into the biological applications. And the challenge was, how do you go back into water? The birthplace for Louis Bruce was in water. Then we got rid of the water because water was terrible for the dots because it oxidized the surface. And now we wanted to put it back in water. That turned out to be quite a challenge. That's a challenge that we solved in different ways. And then the company was born during a bubble in startups because of the internet, the birth of the internet. There's a huge amount of investment in startup companies. It was easy money at the time. So it was born, and a lot of the work at the beginning of the company was how to go from the oil to back to water so you can make it biological compatible. And they solved that problem using a particular method at the time. The real application, which is very widespread today, is in displays. That's a much easier application than biology. That should have been the first application. But because, we were all chemists working with biologists as opposed to working with electrical engineers, we didn't think of it until. But I had a really amazing collaboration with Klaus Jensen in chemical engineering. And he had access to blue diodes from HP. And I remember I did actually most of those experiments myself, putting the dots in polymer and using an NMR tube to sort of shape the dots to be like a hemisphere, the polymer dot combination, and then putting that on top of the diode.
Oh, wow.
And seeing the downshifting of the color from the blue to whatever the color was. And so I wrote a paper with Klaus on dots embedded in polymer to create white light. Because the other thing that was going on technologically at the time was OLEDs. It was the birth of OLEDs. So OLEDs, organic light emitting diodes, were born by accident in the late 1980s. And they hadn't achieved their commercial success that they have today yet. There were still a lot of problems with them. They didn't last very long, etc. And so people were really interested in creating lighting, white light from organic molecules, flexible white light, right? And so making white light was something that was in the air. So we could combine different colors of dots to make real nice white light. And so we talked in that paper that came out in the early 2000s in Advanced Materials. I forgot now which journal it was in. We talk about making saturated colors and white light with quantum dots. That turned out to be the paper that is the important paper then for making the displays, because the initial displays take the blue diode, the gallium nitride diode, as a source of light, and then you incorporate red and green emitting dots in polymer, and you downshift a portion of the blue light to have RGB in your backplane. And then you have your LCD display where you use the liquid crystals, individually addressed pixels of liquid crystals to create your image. It turned out to be the killer app for the quantum dot, as opposed to biology, which, it's still a product that's being sold, being used today, but it's not the killer app. It's not what made it from an interesting research application to a widespread technology. So we're two companies that basically were the pioneers in there. Both using MIT technology, and Berkeley and Nanosys used IP from all over the country, basically. QD Vision was born out of MIT. Both ended up converging on the same application, which was for displays. The first company to use quantum dots for displays was Sony in the 2012-2013 model year, using quantum dots from QD Vision. I had that TV in my office for 10 years, and I have one at home still. Sony wouldn't give me one. I had to actually buy one on sale from Amazon. QD Vision wouldn't give me one because they told me Sony wouldn't give them either. They had to buy them from Sony. So that was the killer app, and then Samsung at the same time, realized this is an interesting application, but cadmium is not the right element to put in a consumer application. In fact, I was surprised when Sony put cadmium in there, because I had met with Sony in the late 1990s, and they had a list of forbidden elements, and cadmium was on the list of forbidden elements. But it worked, and so they put it in there for that model year. Samsung had a large group that ended up making indium phosphide quantum dots. It's a 3.5. It's much harder to make than cat selenide. It's less ionic, so you have to go to higher temperatures. It's just a harder material to make as a quantum dot. But they figured out how to do it and how to make it nice and bright and more stable, etc. And so they then made TVs out of indium phosphide. They bought QD Vision, or the IP and the trademark from QD Vision. So QD Vision had trademarked QLED, QLED. And I think that the big reason why Samsung paid the money to QD Vision was to acquire the QLED trademark. Probably they didn't care about everything else. They just wanted the trademark. Because QLED looks like OLED, except the Q has a little tail on it. Mm-hmm. And then you've got LG selling OLED TVs, and you've got Samsung selling QLED TVs, so there's a great trademark war. OLED is not trademarked.
Now they can call them quantum
and then they
TV.
use the word quantum TV, yes, yeah. So this was, from a marketing perspective, this was genius. Mm-hmm. Right? It also happened to work, but great marketing, yes. Right? Great marketing.
Do you know if they're still using hot injection to produce particles at scale for TVs?
I don't know the exact process, but I gather that commercially, I think hot injection is basically the way that certainly QD Vision was making it using hot injection. I suspect the other companies are as well.
Was there when you were first coming up with hot injection, was there a competing direction, like lithography or something else to produce uniform sized dots?
So what we've been talking about are what in the community we end up calling colloidal quantum dots, made with chemistry. The physicists around the same time were beginning to make quantum dots as well, but in a completely different way, in a very clean way, as physicists tend to want to make things, by basically making what are called strain growth dots, where you have a substrate, and on top of the substrate, you form a thin film of a semiconductor with a smaller band gap, but the growth is strained because the lattice constant is different. And what happens is at the beginning, you end up puddling up little islands of the new material on top of the old material. And the islands have the properties, the quantum confined properties, and those are also called quantum dots. And then you can cap the whole thing with the initial substrate material, and embedded then in your material are these islands of the smaller bandgap material that have quantum confined properties, which then you can go to low temperature and study and do all sorts of incredible physics on that. Those are also quantum dots. And certainly in my career, I've been inspired, heavily inspired by those physics experiments, trying to reproduce some of them with our colloidal dots. But you can't use them to make TVs, those physics dots. You can try to use them to make lasers. You can do all sorts of things, really beautiful things with them.
Single photon sources.
Single photon sources, for instance, which we're also interested in making with colloidal dots. But they're hard to scale because they're made under very pristine vacuum conditions using molecular beams, etc., and BE growth.
If you were to make a vial of quantum dots using the hot injection method, like how many liters or milliliters would you need to cover that TV?
To make that TV here? Actually, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think it would be that much.
It wouldn't be that much, right?
No,
Yeah.
it
So
wouldn't be that much.
actually, Samsung probably doesn't even need like extremely large.
But no, but the companies that make, they make a lot of TVs.
Okay. Yeah.
They make a lot of TVs. QD Vision had scaled up from vials to multi-liter vessels.
But it's still vats, like they didn't
Vats.
scale to flow chemistry.
No, so
for
we tried,
instance.
with Klaus Jensen, we did a lot of flow chemistry work. It turns out that when you do flow chemistry, the rate of flow at the interface is slower than in the center of the flow. You can make the flow chaotic to solve some of these things, but we were never able to make particles quite as good using flow as we did in the one-step experiment, the VAT experiments. Empirically, what I think you observe also is that as you scale the size of the vessel, the reproducibility and the particle quality actually goes up. And
It's the edge effects go away.
edge effects go away. Yeah, it's a surface to volume issue again. Right? The surface to volume ratio goes down, and so everything becomes being made in solution without having to worry about the walls of the flask.